2020 edition of the UAE Tech Podcast, a series of discussions on how technology is reshaping governance and economics in the United Arab Emirates. From our offices in Media City, Dubai, I'm John Lillywhite with Al Bawaba Business.
So I was sort of generation 2.5 when I entered the business. And my background was working in a company in Hong Kong that was actually selling a lot of this equipment in those days. And I was in a company that was an angel investor in a 3D printing startup, which we went on to represent about 10 years later in the UAE. And it all sort of came from there because we then looked at the opportunities. And when we got into 3D printing, we started at about 2012. The UAE was not a natural market for 3D printing supplies. The big thing we saw was where were 3D printers selling in other parts of the world? They were going into manufacturing. They were going into where people needed prototyping, where there was a lot of design work happening, where there was an automotive sector, a defense sector. And we just didn't have any of that in our region. So we looked at it and said, so how do we create a market? And we then identified a few segments early on that were there. And the biggest of them was education. And that's actually what we sat and focused on and what's our primary market even today.
A couple of years ago, there was a big buzz around 3D printing. Many tech analysts suggested a future in which we'd all be print publishing the consumer items we needed in our homes. Well, that hasn't happened yet. It's even possible that 3D printing on the consumer end of the spectrum will remain a niche skill set favoured by designers, engineers, or inventors. But the wider industrial implications of 3D printing are emerging fast. Right now, students across the UAE are learning the process, software, and techniques necessary to operate a 3D printer. Beyond education, architects and defence firms have long been exploring the technology. Over the past decade, one electronics store in particular has played a key role in importing 3D printing technology to the UAE. For veterans of Dubai, Jacky's electronics store in Nasr Square Deira is already a familiar landmark. It was established in 1988. We spoke with Chief Operating Officer Ashish Panjabi on how Jacky's electronics has merged into Jacky's business solutions, for a behind-the-scenes look into the small changes that are incrementally building UAE capacity in additive manufacturing. Today we're talking with Ashish Panjabi from Jacky's Business Solutions on 3D printing in the UAE. Ashish, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, John. Great to be here.
So could you tell us a little bit about the history of Jacky's Business Solutions, how you got started and the kind of technologies and services you're offering today?
Sure. So Jacky's is not a new company. We actually turned 50 in July of this year. We started in 1970 as a company based out of Hong Kong, primarily as a mail order company. And we set up in Dubai in 1985 with our second mail order hub. And we've grown from there. We aren't in the mail order business anymore. And we're probably best known in the UAE as an electronics retailer. But Jacky's Business Solutions actually got its origins about 6 years ago. And not because it was a new business for us, it was because we had a number of businesses within the group that were split across various different group companies. And we sort of consolidated all of them into one company called Jacky's Business Solutions that we created 6 years ago. So within Jacky's Business Solutions, we are in the business of selling 3D printing equipment, large format printing equipment for a number of brands, primarily in the graphic space, as well as some finishing solutions, cutting products and things of that type. And then we have another side of the business where we're selling robotics, humanoid robots. So we work with SoftBank Robotics, Temi, Double Robotics, and a few other brands. And then we have another part of the business which sells queuing systems, where literally it's one of those things where you go into a government, bank, a hospital, you pull a ticket, get a number, and get served to a counter. But apart from just that, it's all the data that goes behind all of that, and the feedback that we can provide.
That's an interesting company trajectory. So how did Jacky's go from kind of mail order in Hong Kong to a consumer outlet in the UAE to now working on these more sophisticated business solutions such as robotics and 3D printing and ticketing services?
Well, I think a lot of it just happens with evolution. I don't think anyone is doing the same thing they were doing 50 years ago if they were around 50 years ago. And I think this is a natural evolution that happened. Hong Kong is a fairly entrepreneurial city, and so was Dubai in 1985 when we set up. And that was when we started as a mail order company. And in 1988, we had the inventory kept in the warehouse, and we had in the same building where our office was, a store that got vacated downstairs, and the landlord said, "Do you want to take it?" And that was in Nasr Square Deira. And we set up there in 1988, and we still have the store running today. And it was a question of, if we have the goods in the warehouse, put it in the store and get some cash flow out of it. And that was our entry into retail. It wasn't planned, it wasn't strategic. It was one of those things that happened, and we sort of took it from there. And then we started working with a number of brands, and we were doing things in the office equipment space, in the appliances space, with a number of brands. And a lot of what came in with the graphics businesses, with the large format 3D, were actually when we had different people get into the business. So I was one of them that came in, and we're a family-owned business, and sort of every half generation, we have someone come in just because of the age gap of the family members. So I was sort of generation 2.5 when I entered the business. And my background was working in a company in Hong Kong that was actually selling a lot of this equipment in those days. And I was in a company that was an angel investor in a 3D printing startup, which we went on to represent about 10 years later in the UAE. And it all sort of came from there, because we then looked at the opportunities. And when we got into 3D printing, we started at about 2012. The UAE was not a natural market for 3D printing supplies. The big thing we saw was, where were 3D printers selling in other parts of the world? They were going into manufacturing. They were going into where people needed prototyping, where there was a lot of design work happening, where there was an automotive sector, a defense sector. And we just didn't have any of that in our region. So we looked at it and said, so how do we create a market? And we then identified a few segments early on that were there. And the biggest of them was education. And that's actually what we sat and focused on, and what's our primary market even today. And yeah, we've seen it develop from there onwards.
So fast forwarding to today, you've said, one of the key opportunities was education, but what are the reasons for the buzz around 3D printing here in the UAE? Why do you think education is important with this technology? And how do you think the technology, particularly the services you guys are providing, what are the use cases for that? What are the kind of examples of people using the 3D printers you have at Jacky's here in the UAE?
Sure. So when it started, I think a lot of it, we were selling into universities, and we were selling into research universities, and we were selling into universities that were starting to adopt a STEM curriculum. STEM is science, technology, engineering, maths. And there was a lot more focus on that, because if you looked at universities in the region years ago, you essentially had two types of universities. You had the university that prepared you for government, for a civil service job. And they had the other university that prepared you to get an MBA, a business degree, and that was it. And I think with the focus in the UAE changing over the years, the government was fairly proactive in terms of trying to promote other curriculums and look at what else they could do, because they realized they cannot take everyone into government and give them jobs. That wasn't going to happen. And there's only so many MBAs a market can have. And you need to have universities that start to develop other curriculums and other specialities. And we saw that primarily with a lot of the government-run universities. So American University in Sharjah was an excellent example. Khalifa University in Abu Dhabi, Masdar University, before that got merged into Khalifa, the Petroleum Institute. And these were sort of the people, as well as you had in Saudi Arabia, KAUST, the King Abdulaziz University over there as well. And you saw a lot of things start to develop from there, where a lot of universities started investing in 3D printing equipment. And that is when 3D printers itself were quite expensive. So the cheapest 3D printer we had was about $35,000 at that time. And what they were buying was that plus the equipment that was going at $100,000, $150,000, $200,000. So we were talking a big ticket and not something that anyone could buy. And the reason they looked at it is we also started to see the landscape change in the UAE as well as the rest of the region, where the focus went from looking at what we're doing and saying we are an economy that's based on consuming, that's based on importing, that's based on getting in the knowledge, but we actually weren't producing, we weren't creating, we weren't designing, we weren't innovating. And I think a lot of that focus started to change. And as we get into situations now, when we look at COVID, for example, and you start to see Khalifa University saying we're designing a mask that's recyclable and that's good for a one-time use, or you're starting to see everyone design their own face shields, you start to see the result of what's happening from that end. And again, I think that the one thing that I saw, and a classic example was we started working with the Dubai Future Foundation fairly early on, and we supplied a lot of the 3D printers that went into the DFF when they first started. And I remember talking to one of the procurement people over there, and he was fairly young. He was in his mid-20s, and he was an engineering graduate. And he was talking about 3D printers, and we were discussing the supply of 3D printers over there at the time. And then he sort of asked me at one stage, he goes, listen, I've been asked to speak to you for 3D printers, but I actually don't know about the technology. And I'm an engineering graduate. I said, when did you graduate? He goes, 5 years ago. So the whole concept of 3D printing didn't even exist when he was at university 5 years earlier. And you sort of saw where suddenly the whole way of doing something changed with a piece of technology like this. And from then on, we've seen this technology move where it's gotten cheaper, it's gotten faster, we've seen more materials, and we've seen it move from universities into the K-12 education segment today, where in secondary schools as well as some primary schools, you start to see it being used.
Thank you for that summary. That's a great example of the education and the higher education system incubating technology change here in the country. And that's not something that we've probably spoken enough about on the podcast to date, because obviously, in the States, universities played a historic role in incubating. You were talking about COVID-19. So Dubai has also been trying ways to 3D print metro spare parts. And as you said, importing them is extremely expensive. But if you can create them, design and build them locally, it saves a lot of time and it saves a lot of cost. So Ashish, in terms of the 3D printers you guys are using here in the UAE, I've got some names. I've got the MakerBot 3D printer. I've got the Big Rep 1. And the various sizes, some of them are massive and look quite daunting. And some of them, I think, as you alluded to, are a lot smaller and probably, a lot more accessible to consumers than they were, 5, 10, 20 years ago. So what kind of 3D printing services is Jacky's offering access to now? Is it really for universities and governments and corporate customers, or is there a consumer level to this now as well?
Yeah, so I mean, that's an interesting one. So the vision that a lot of the media were portraying a couple of years ago was there's going to be a 3D printer in every house. And this is where brands like MakerBot, which was sort of at the forefront of the entry level 3D printers, were thrust into the spotlight, and we worked quite closely with them during that period. We did try selling it through the consumer channels. We did try selling it through our own outlets. We were having it at Jacky Shopper, but we were selling it essentially to enthusiasts. And it is not something that's going to go much beyond that at this stage. For the fact is, it's not really a consumer product. For a consumer to use it, they need to be highly skilled, highly knowledgeable, because it's not just about printing. It's also about what you do with the stuff that you print. There is a finishing element to it. There is at times an assembly element to it. There is also the idea of getting the 3D image and trying to design that, which, although there are tools that make it easier, it isn't something that you can do off the shelf. So you could print a widget or two, you could print a toothbrush holder for yourself, a keychain, and then after that you say, what next? So at the consumer level, we aren't quite there. And there's a lot of things that go into when we talk about 3D printing, and even what you said about the metro example. The idea is that we could disrupt logistics, we could disrupt supply chains with 3D printing, but there is also a lot of IP involved in what's being designed today. So if I had a BMW car and if I had a part that I needed to be replaced in a BMW car, now is it a question that I could print it myself and download it? But wait a second, BMW owns the designs for that part, and wouldn't they want something for it? And is there something like an app store where they could get the revenue from it if I were to print it myself? But then I'm putting it in a car, and then there's health and safety and performance issues that you need to consider. So we aren't quite there. What we're going to see, though, is a BMW dealer in a certain country who could probably 3D print it and certify it and make sure that it is done to that standard, and they don't need to invest in a massive warehouse and write off 50% of the stocks that they import as spare parts because they never get consumed, or keep someone waiting for 6 months for a part for a car that was 15 years old because they could just produce that on demand. So that's probably what we're going to see first at this stage. The other area where we start to see 3D printing come in is into things like personalization. And what we're starting to see is growing acceptance of people designing and creating things and then saying, can I print this for myself and have someone do it for me? And this is what we started to see. The other big thing is with now a lot of kids starting to use 3D printers. They're going through the school system, whether at secondary, whether at university level, and they're coming into the workplace and now saying, how can I use a 3D printer at work? And the example I typically use is, I think about the personal computer industry about 30 years ago. And most kids got to use their first PC 30 years ago in school. And there was a couple of computers in a school. Then it went to where there was a lab where there were 30 computers in a class to go in and use the lab by turns, to the stage where everyone had one in the school. And by the time they were in the workplace, everyone was using a computer. And 3D printing is sort of going in that way as well, where it is starting to get adopted a lot more. A lot of the schools you supply to today, at the secondary level especially, have maybe 2, 3, 4 3D printers in the school. That isn't enough. They aren't going to do anything with that. It's once you get into a lab and you've got about 30 of them in there, that they can actually start using it, and then we start to see things develop from there. And then when these kids, and this is why I was quite excited with the education sector, is when they come out and they're in the workplace, they will use this knowledge and they will start to do something with it, and they will start to create and they will start to produce, and then we start to see us move from being an economy that was importing and consuming into one that produces and that exports actually knowledge in that way.
What about software then? Because, to use these 3D printers, I've got some friends in design, and I've got some friends who've been experimenting with 3D printing on their Instagrams and social media feeds for a couple of years now. And a lot of them happen to be designers. So they had good software skills. They understood how to use, programs like CAD and design things in 3D. And it did seem to be, it looked to be a very exciting process. It was something that, everyone can understand. And I would have loved to have, 3D printer for Lego or whatever as a kid. But yeah, using the software element of it and really understanding how the technology can be incorporated into other things like architecture or other kind of products, actually that was quite tough. So what about entrepreneurs? What is being done in the UAE to kind of figure out those things? What kind of institutions or organizations are there outside of the education system to kind of assist entrepreneurs with having access to this technology, right? Because if I'm an architect and I think I can, create a ceiling or a floor using a 3D printer, then presumably I need access to much more advanced, large machines than I could ordinarily get access to. And then what about, again, entrepreneurs that just have a very cute idea. Maybe they have one application for 3D printing, but it's a very well positioned application that could, as you said, produce face masks at a tenth of the cost.
With architecture, this was actually one of the first segments we identified in 2012, and we thought this was going to be a great opportunity for us. There's a lot of construction, there's a lot of building, and we saw the 3D models being produced everywhere, and we thought, great, we'll attack that market. And we worked with Autodesk, and we did a couple of Autodesk universities, and we were working with their partners and at their events, and we got nothing. And the main thing we realized was they were using 3D software, they were using 3D Autodesk, but designing for 3D and printing in 3D is quite different. Because when you design something in 3D on a screen, it's meant to look one way. And when you design it to print, you need to then think about gravity suddenly and all the structures that need to be in place to make sure that that design can actually stand after you print it. And we found that if you went and took the average AutoCAD file that was designed and you had to print it, you had to make about 250 adjustments to that file in order to print it. And that's something that just most designers didn't have that insight with them in terms of looking into that when they were designing a file to think about how it would be printed. So that was a barrier, and that's held back that part of the industry. From the software side, we have seen a lot of things happen with companies like SolidWorks and others. Adobe been on there. And at the school level, you've seen them start to put apps onto the iPad and try and do that and try and make it easier. You do have lots of sites as well, like Thingiverse, that allows you to download 3D printed files that other people have done. And these are open source, and you can take them and you can start to print them at your end. But yeah, so getting people to design in 3D was one of the challenges, again, which is why education is quite important, because that's where they learn to use a lot of these softwares. And that's also where we're going to see the applications, I think, develop as we go on. But the other part that you mentioned about them in the workplace, so what we have at the moment essentially is a lot of people have got access to 3D printers in two places. One is at a lot of the labs that have come up over here. So like I mentioned, the White Future Foundation, you can go to places like In5, etc. And a lot of them have now got 3D printers over there. So a lot of startups have got the ability to go there and start to use them. And the other thing that we've seen emerge is the concept of the service bureau for 3D printers. So there are a few that are there in the UAE right now. And the service bureau, if you think about it, is like your Kinko's. It's like a copy shop where you would typically go back in the past to get things produced en masse when you had to get things printed in volumes, or where you had to get things printed in a particular way and bound and all of that. So you do have service bureaus that are starting to emerge where you can take a lot of this and get it done over there. The other thing otherwise is you've got the internet, and there are various platforms online where you have got services that will help you, that work as aggregators. And they will take a file and they will direct you to someone in a particular part of the world that could print a file and send it to you. So it may not be someone in the UAE, it could be someone in Sweden who prints that file and sends it back to you. But obviously having someone closer is better, because if you want to keep making changes and if you want to keep iterating on a design, it's easier when it's nearby.
That is kind of fascinating, isn't it? The idea, because manufacturing was always so physical. You'd be there with your welder or your machines, and you'd be cutting the steel or whatever in the Industrial Revolution. And now this idea that you'd have teams of kind of software experts or people who know how to use these 3D software packages, sharing files and open source and adapting them according to what they want to build is kind of fascinating. And it's not something that you think of when you think of 3D printing. You often think of the end product or the glitzy machine. But actually behind the machine and behind the end product, there's this kind of community of software developers who know how to use or who know how to manipulate the designs. And as you alluded to, kind of optimize them for 3D printing. And yeah, I mean, that's not something I think that gets talked about enough. I had some experience of using CAD in the UK when I was a teenager, and that was strange for me because I was an arts graduate. And I was kind of fascinated about how a CAD drawing would then be translated into these massive structures. But the idea now, that's happening on a totally different scale in 3D. It does make you think. Now, I was reading a little bit into this because apparently there's a new process of manufacturing on the corporate level called additive manufacturing, the creation of 3D printed objects using an additive process, which is powered by 3D printing. And it says the idea of additive process manufacturing is laying down successive layers of material until the entire object is created. Each of these layers can be seen as thinly sliced horizontal cross-section of the eventual object. Now, I know that large corporations, some of the largest, such as GE Energy, defense sector organizations, and organizations in transport and construction are all looking at these new manufacturing techniques using 3D printers. What is the timeline on these kind of processes? How near are they to being incorporated into factories in the UAE and even around the world, actually?
So we already have that, and 3D printing and additive manufacturing are one and the same thing, essentially. So you have additive manufacturing where you print layer by layer, and you've got subtractive manufacturing, which is what you would typically be using a CNC machine for, or a router or anything of that, where you would have a block and you would take away the layers to get the finished product. And here you do it the other way, where you build the layers one by one. And I think we're at a stage where the two of them are actually working together. You can't do everything with just additive manufacturing. The thing to think about with additive manufacturing today and 3D printing in general is you've got various things you need to think of. You've got different types of materials. You've got different types of strengths of the materials. You have to adapt to different environments and temperatures. They need to be, in some cases, water resistant. They need to be, in some cases, heat resistant. In some cases, they need to be flexible. In some cases, they need to be rigid. And trying to get the material science behind it in place is still where most of the work is, quite honestly, at this stage. And 3D printing isn't a fast technology. It's something that's slower. It takes a lot more time to produce. And I think this is where we're seeing it evolve and adapt now. Where we've seen 3D printers used in manufacturing at times is not maybe in the finished product, but in designing the mold that the product goes into, and designing the mold for that. Or where there is a customized product, or there's a smaller scale production that happens, and it doesn't make sense to go the analog way of doing it. And if we talk about the UAE in particular, what's exciting over here when you compare it with Europe and the US and other markets is those have been manufacturing economies that have worked a certain way. And you've had people who've had skill sets that have gone down from generation to generation, and they've been told, this is the way you produce this particular widget. When we look at the Gulf and we look at the UAE, we're starting on a blank sheet of paper because we've never had the legacy over here to hold us back. And we're designing and we're building whatever we've done on the manufacturing side with the technology that's available today. And we're starting to design and create using 3D printing, using subtractive manufacturing, and using the best of both. With a young population that's coming through the university system, if you look at any of the countries in the region, we're talking 50% are below the age of 25. So there is a young population that is coming in that has got the willingness and the interest to learn how to use this technology. And they've now been given the canvas and said, how do you produce this part if you had to produce it today? Not how was it done earlier, and how was the legacy there? And yes, we are talking about a lot of corporates adopting it, but they've had to do massive change to make that happen. And the adoption for them is going to be far slower than it is for someone that's starting over here. So one of the classic examples, if we look at in the UAE, for example, is there is a company called Strata, which is based in Abu Dhabi, which produces components for Airbus and Boeing. Now they're using the technology of today because most of their graduates came out of the universities in the last couple of years over here. And these people are now producing using 3D printers and other such technologies and designing and contract manufacturing for Airbus and Boeing. That gives us a lot more advantage. Now, I think about that person who's working in a Strata today, and the figures you see is a lot of them are Emirati, a lot of them are women as well. So you've got now suddenly a lot more democratization in terms of access to these technologies to a lot more people that would traditionally be in that segment. And that graduate who's been at Strata for 5 years decides to leave Strata and do something else. Now, she's probably going to do something else with that knowledge. And that's actually what excites me, because that's what we're going to start to see going forward. And I think this is actually where we start to see the UAE put its foot in the ground and say, this is what we've done.
Well, thanks for that market analysis and what you described there in terms of speed, the speed of 3D printing actually at times being quite slow, and then the speed of the historical process. So that idea of leapfrogging a stage of development in the manufacturing cycle to kind of innovate countries that have had manufacturing for over 100 years, but almost have to relearn everything they've learned, and that creating new opportunities for new kinds of graduates, for women, and for, it looks like, emerging tech companies in Abu Dhabi. That's a really exciting future. I have read that the focus on 3D printing technologies, a directive was passed with the idea of making 25% of all construction in Dubai 3D printed by 2030. But I suppose to finish, one of the things I wanted to ask you was for your insights on what do you think the next stage for 3D printing is in the UAE? Or what are the most exciting near horizon opportunities?
Yeah, I mean, so I think the UAE has been quite visionary that way, and even back in 2012, I was engaged with the Prime Minister's office, and we had something called the 3D PIA, 3D Printing Innovation Alliance, that we unofficially created back then to talk about what to do with 3D printing in the country. So some of what's come out as announcements has been early work that happened back then by a number of individuals that could foresee what was happening. And these are the same people that have looked at other technologies such as AI, robotics, blockchain, and looked at where all of these things fit in. Now, I look at it from a lens of saying, you've got to think about all of these things together, not in isolation, because none of these technologies grow in isolation. And when you start to look at all the emerging tech that's coming in and you start to put them together, you start to say, where can it start to evolve and move forward? Today, when they talk about 25% of construction by 2030, it doesn't only mean the concrete. The concrete is probably where a lot of people think is you print in 3D on concrete. But there's a lot of challenges to that, because again, if you're printing layer by layer, and if you have any sort of seismic activity, you just need one layer to get unstuck, and then you see a building collapse. But what you can start to do is a lot of the mold that you pour the concrete into can be 3D printed. And using that, so you can then look at customized designs of buildings, or you look at different structures, and you start to look at all the services inside a building, and the thousands and thousands of things that go inside a building when you're doing it. is where does 3D printing fit into all of that? And by asking the question, you start to challenge the people that design these things. So I know with the 3D printed office, when that came up in front of the Emirates Towers a couple of years ago, that was something it's not a very large building, but it made a lot of people who had various roles in it, whether it be the air conditioning, whether it be the MEP, whether it be the people that were putting the cement together, look at it and say, how can we do this now using 3D printing technology? And you start to ask the questions and you start to innovate that way. And I think as a result of that, you say, well, I've used it for this application. I could use it somewhere else as well now and use the same knowledge there. And I think this is what we're going to start to see is people thinking in that direction and people thinking in that way. And honestly, it's exciting. It's extremely exciting. And I remember I was at a conference many years ago, and this is a quote I've used quite often. There was a girl who was a fashion designer who put her hand up during a panel discussion and said, I want to design something and sell it in a shop locally, but no one here is going to keep it. But Giorgio Armani was Giorgio Armani in Italy before he was Giorgio Armani to the rest of the world. And the moderator of the panel turned around to the retailers at that time and said, who would like to keep this lady's fashion in their stores? And one or two of them had to put their hands up because they were on the spot in front of an audience. And I think about it now and I say, how many people of that type will we have over here where they become names in our country before they become names to the rest of the world? And I think that's where I honestly see the UAE going and the vision of the country going. And we're being challenged by government to do that. When I speak to people in other parts of the world, they complain that the education sector doesn't get the investment for 3D printing because the budgets don't exist. Over here, the budgets are there. They have been given the budgets to invest, whether private, whether public. And I think this is what I see in most parts of the world. It's private sector leading and the government lagging. And over here, we've seen the government lead and the private sector is lagging, but we're struggling to keep up with what the government tells us because they've got such a vision ahead of them. And I think without that, we wouldn't see half of what we're seeing happen at this moment in the region.
Well, thanks for that analysis. Yeah, I mean, in the last episode, that was kind of a key theme, the idea of the center of innovation gravity, or the centrifugal forces of innovation being pushed out from government to the same extent, if not to a larger extent, than from the private sector. And for those listening, the Dubai Future Foundation office, I think it is, opposite DIFC, right?
Yeah, the 3D printed office.
Yeah, is 3D printed. It's a very well-known, iconic image. We will try and get a picture of it in the article when we published it. That wasn't done by Jacky's Business Solutions, although I believe there was some kind of role there in terms of consulting.
So what we did was there is the hand which is outside the office with Sheikh Mohammed's victory sign.
Great. Everyone takes an Instagram shot there. Yeah.
So we that was designed by us. We 3D scanned the hand and we got that produced for them.
Well, we will get a picture of the hand in the episode when we published it then on the website. But yeah, and just finally, I think that point you made about there are different technologies involved here. You know, how will these technologies come together? 3D printing, AI, Internet of Things devices in roads and across the city is really one of the big questions for the future. And you know, everyone is working on these individual technologies, but how entrepreneurs build them into their fashion line, or how they connect and merge some of these emerging new systems, I think, you know, as you said, that will be where the future is. So Ashish, thank you so much for joining us today for some really interesting insights into some of the opportunities, challenges, and perhaps future trends of 3D printing in the UAE.
Thank you, John. Pleasure being here.